Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another video. This is in response to Nazarinprod's video of a suggestion that I gave him for 10 films that shouldn't really work, but do. So I'm going to just go through 10 films that I think fit that bill. Please do leave in your comments examples of films that you think shouldn't work but do. Some of these are fairly obvious, and some of them I'm perhaps just thinking a little bit differently about. So we'll start with One Cut of the Dead by Shinichiro Ueda, which is a terrible pronunciation, and this is quite a recent film. And the reason that this shouldn't really work is, yes, it's another zombie film, and it's amazing how long the zombie cycle has lasted, and it continually doesn't seem to have an end to it. And the reason that this shouldn't really work is because the first 40 minutes of it is strangely enough done in one cut, and it's a fairly standard film crew shooting a zombie film become overrun with real zombies, and it's completely generic and standard fare, and you're like, yeah, that's not really that interesting. And then the rest of the film happens. So we get to the end of that 40-minute section, and then we go back in time to see the making of the film, and then in the last third of the film we actually get to see them making the film, and it becomes a wonderfully funny, touching, not only an amazing kind of how to shoot a low budget film training video almost, but it completely takes on a whole different level of that whole film about making a film about making a film. So on paper, if you're not like a zombie fan, it's so worth your while if you can get past the first 40 minutes, which is standard zombie stuff. So that's why it's on the list, just because it elevates itself in the last two sections of the film compared with the first section of the film, which is fairly bog standard. Now the next two choices are films that you'll probably say, what are you thinking about? They should of course work because of the filmmakers that made them, but I'll try and explain myself. It might not be a very good explanation, but I'll try and explain myself. The first one's Dr. Strangelove by Kubrick, and again you can say, well, why wouldn't that work? Because it's Stanley Kubrick, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. It's like, well, it's made in 1963. It came out the same year as Failsafe, which is Sidney Lumet's straight version of the same source novel. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't that long ago, and Kubrick made the decision to make a joke of global annihilation, which at the time probably was a bit of a gamble. Again, I'm not sure how this film was actually taken when it came out, and depending on where you were. But obviously global annihilation through nuclear war was still in the air. I mean, it's amazing that we just kind of forget about it now and we don't think about it, even though there's more and more countries that have nuclear capability. So it is amazing that there hasn't actually been more nuclear weapons set off, even by accident. But for some reason we're obsessed about other things and kind of things that aren't quite as important, and we get lost in the trivialities of life that we kind of forget that our civilization could stop fairly quickly if people just started throwing these bombs about. And obviously Kubrick made this right at the time where it was more prevalent, more people were thinking about it, but he just kind of took the tact, it's just so awful that we have to make it a comedy. And of course it works. It's a better film than Failsafe, which is a very good film with Henry Fonda and Walter Matthau and Larry Hagman, but that's played deadly serious, even with a little bit of Walter Matthau sly black humour. So that's why this is on the list. Again, it might seem an odd choice, but it could have failed miserably. The alternate ending, they were going to have a custard pie fight in the war room. Obviously you can't fight in here because it's the war room, but they were going to have a custard pie fight to end the film, which I don't think would have worked as well as Major Kong riding a bomb and Vera Lynn kicking in with the mushroom clouds. So that might be an odd choice, but I'm desperate. Next, again, you'd think, well, because of the filmmaker, of course it should work. That's Stalker by Tarkovsky, which again is Tarkovsky, so of course it would work. Why wouldn't it? But it's a science fiction without much science and fiction in it. It's about a stalker who's a guide who takes a writer and a professor into the zone to find a room where your biggest wish will come true. And that sounds like a wonderful Wizard of Oz journey of excitement and fun, but this is Tarkovsky. It's fairly slow and meditative, and again, despite the fact it shouldn't really work, it kind of does, because every step that feels there's a weight to it, every decision that they make when they're trying to navigate this zone, which is just burnt out buildings and water, which is always important in Tarkovsky films, and grass and trees, bricks and stones. Every kind of decision, every step seems to carry weight until they get to the room at the end. And it's quite an engrossing film and a thrilling film, even though everything about it suggests that it shouldn't be. So again, you might argue whether this should be on the list, but just from a synopsis point of view and then how it's actually done, you might think, well, I'm not really interested in something like that. That doesn't sound like a rocking good time, but it kinda is. Next is 32 short films about Glenn Gould, which definitely needs a Blu-ray release. It's a film by Francois Girard, who also did The Red Violin, which is also excellent as well. And the reason this perhaps shouldn't work, but it does, is because it's a biopic of the famous pianist Glenn Gould, but it doesn't do that bog standard biopic thing of just going through people's life chronologically. This happened and that happened and this happened. I mean, biopics aren't particularly my favourite genre in the world because they do tend to be fairly uninteresting. But what 32 short films does is it literally is made up of 32 short films, which encapsulates and gives you an idea of what Glenn Gould was like. So we get audio snippets of him playing, we get audio snippets of him talking, we get little scenes acted out by Colm Farror. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. So he plays Glenn Gould, and there's just random fictionalized events of him in a diner or telephone calls. But again, this just builds up the portrait of an artist. And again, it shouldn't really work because of that fragmented way it's actually made. But it does work because it's all these little pieces that kind of come together at the end. And again, it's more experimental compared with your usual biopics, which tend to be pretty uninspiring most of the time because they do follow that formula. Whereas 32 short films with Glenn Gould throws the formula out, and it's just wonderful. And again, needs a Blu-ray release. Next is Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight, which is just about a masterpiece. But the reason it shouldn't work is, as usual, it was shot over a couple of years as Welles went and got money and then came back and filmed some more. It's shot in different locations. He had different cast members for only different times. There's scenes where John Gielgud's character is talking to the prince, but from behind it's not John Gielgud because John Gielgud wasn't there, so it's somebody playing John Gielgud's back. The fact that the script was written by Welles and it takes bits from 4 different Shakespeare plays, so it's not from one Shakespeare play. He takes bits from Henry IV, Richard II, Henry V and the Merry Wives of Windsor as he constructs the character of Falstaff, which he plays himself. So it's not a straight Shakespeare adaptation. It's taken from bits of different Shakespeare things. When he was in college, I believe, he staged a version of this himself when he was in his obviously formative years, and he always had this in his mind. Falstaff's his favourite Shakespeare character. I mean, the film, as usual, Welles looks absolutely amazing. It's got one of the best battle scenes in history, which was, I believe, like a field in Paris or Barcelona, I'm not actually sure, I can't remember, but it was basically just a park where they rocked up for a day, did a battle scene and then left. But you wouldn't really tell because it's just so well done. It's brutal, it's muddy. You know, Orson Welles, or a stand-in for Orson Welles, is kind of plodding around in his armour, in his fat armour. The film at the end is quite moving. You can't help not only get emotional about the Falstaff character but Orson Welles himself. And again, because it's so bitty, not only in the production but the script, you know, it's a bit of a magpie of a script taking bits from other plays, but it just works. I would say it's almost a masterpiece, but again, I need to watch it more times. I've maybe only seen it about 3 times. I need to watch it again. The print's fantastic, by the way, on the Criterion. Next, I mean, you could argue whether this film actually works or not, but that's in the eye of the beholder. That's Saul Bass and Phase 4, the only film Saul Bass ever directed. Probably the reason it shouldn't work is because it's about ants, but not in the ants sense of animated characters. This is about two scientists, Michael Murphy and Nigel Davenport, who are studying strange ant behaviour out in the desert. And that's pretty much about it. But because it's shot so interestingly, you see like almost an ant perspective. The two scientists are just played so well, and they believe in what they're doing. Again, not much happens apart from they discover these ant colonies, and perhaps the ants are studying them. It shouldn't really work, but it kind of does in a cult 70s film kind of way. I mean, I'm not sure why Saul Bass never made another film. Whether the studios watched this and just said, you're never getting the reins ever again. Or what actually happened, because obviously he's more famous for doing opening credits in films. But Phase 4 is a fascinating little film that again shouldn't really work because it's about the study of ants, which perhaps isn't the most riveting cinematic entertainment, but it's quite awesome. Next is Primer with Shane Carruth, written by and starring and directing Shane Carruth, back in 2004. Again, this needs like an Arrow Academy Blu-ray release. The reason Primer shouldn't work is low budget time travel film, but because it's so low budget, there's literally no special effects. We don't really see the machine that causes the time travel. We don't see, and plus the time travel is not like years, it's only like minutes or a couple of hours. It's just these two friends that build this thing, and during the course of the film, or the first part of the film, we don't really know what they're building, because again we just see like bits, we don't actually see what it looks like really. And that's why it shouldn't work. It's low budget, we're not really told everything, we're not shown everything, when the kind of big, oh we've been doing time travel reveal is, it's done in a very subtle, matter-of-fact way. You know, if it was a big budget film, it would be a completely different experience and movie. But for some reason, the understatedness just works. It's actually a little creepy and a little disturbing, and it's such a good little film, and again, needs a Blu-ray release. But it shouldn't work just because it's about something that's really exciting and something that we've all kind of fantasized about. But the reality is, it's only, you know, they don't go back and meet dinosaurs, they don't, you know, go into the future. It's a much more contained and small time travel idea, but it's still wonderful. Next is The Ruling Class by Peter Medak, which I absolutely adore despite its many flaws, and that's kind of why it's on the list, because it shouldn't really work because it's a bit of a mess. It feels like one of Richard Lester's 60s, early 70s films, but not as disciplined. You know, those Richard Lester films feel like they're wild and they're anarchic, but there's actually a really tight structure to them, and they're so well written. This one is a bit wilder, not in the Billy sense. It's a bit of a mess. There's like songs in it that people just burst into song, but it's absolutely riveting. I mean, it's 2.5 hours long. It's about Peter O'Toole, who believes he's Jesus, and he comes out of an insane asylum to take over the estate. It's got a great cast with Alistair Sim, and Arthur Lowe is wonderful as the Marxist butler. Harry Andrews makes a brief appearance. Coral Brown. It's just, it shouldn't work because it's such a mess. It's so undisciplined. It's so wild. But that's just part of its charm. Again, it's available in Criterion DVD, but again, it really needs a Blu-ray release. It's 2.5 hours long, but it somehow manages still to be riveting. And it's a film that you probably won't forget if you watch it, which is always a good start for a film. But it's completely nuts, and that's perhaps why it shouldn't work, and for a lot of people it perhaps won't work. A lot of people might find it just too annoying, but it's just wonderful. Peter O'Toole's absolutely fantastic in it, as he goes from Jesus to a little bit of Jack the Ripper, and again, it shouldn't work, but it kind of does. Next is perhaps a little, maybe it doesn't belong in this list, but The Quiet Earth. I've just kind of put this in because it shouldn't really work, because for the majority of the film it's just Bruno Lawrence wandering about after everybody's been wiped out, which you could say, well, it works in the Mega Man, so why shouldn't it work for this? But Bruno Lawrence isn't fighting any zombies or vampires or whatever. It's just himself reacting to the world, fantasizing about the world. You know, sometimes we all wish that we could be the only person left. Granted, the film changes at some point when he finds another couple of people, and that leads to possible romantic tension, as it's a man and a woman. So it's 2 men, 1 woman. 1 woman, yeah. And again, it shouldn't really work because for the vast majority of the film it is just one guy and there's not a lot happening. But when we actually find out why the 3 people have survived, it's a really nice touch. And the film does work because the characterizations between the 3 and Bruno Lawrence initially is an interesting enough character that we're kind of hooked into his story. So again, perhaps in the hands of somebody else, Jeff Murphy directed this, in the hands of somebody else it might not work, and perhaps it shouldn't work because there's no kind of antagonist force attacking Bruno Lawrence when he's on his own. It's just the world. But because it's so well written and so well acted, it just works. And finally, this is a film that's featured on my 150 favourites. It's Alain Resnais' My American Uncle. And the reason it shouldn't really work, again, Resnais every now and again will do a fairly experimental film. This is one of his more experimental films. It shouldn't work because we're introduced to these 3 characters and we're kind of kept at a distance from them. A 4th character is introduced, who's this behavioural biologist who essentially narrates these people's behaviour. And then there's a wonderful device about an hour and a bit in, which I won't spoil it for, that you're either going to love or you're going to hate. So again, it perhaps shouldn't work because it is a distancing kind of technique and a mechanism, but because we can see ourselves in these people's behaviour, and if you can't see yourself in some of these people's behaviour, I think you're probably fibbing. It's just that introduction of the 4th character, the behavioural biologist who explains the behaviour on a cellular level, and a lot of it's quite wordy, especially at the start. Resnais uses a lot of still images of nature, and we have this biologist explaining behaviours and mechanisms and stuff like that. You could argue it perhaps shouldn't work because it's a bit dry, it's a bit theoretical. But once you're introduced to the people's lives, for example, one of Gerard Depardieu, it just becomes fascinating, and it's one of those films that for me is just one of the greatest films of all time, and it's one of those films that will make you think about your life whether you want to or not. It will make you think about the choices that you've made, the fact that you thought that choice was made by you, even though a lot of it is actually just driven by innate biology. It's just a wonderful film, and again, really needs a Blu-ray, like quite a lot of Resnay's work. Yeah, tremendous. So that's 10 films that probably shouldn't work, or might not work for a lot of people, but I think they do. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope that was some form of response to Nazarinprod's prodding. And again, leave comments below of some films that you think shouldn't work but actually do. And hopefully you'll join me again for more videos. I'll leave a link to Nazarin's video. And hopefully you'll join me again. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying I have accepted the challenge. Might not have been successful, but the challenge has been accepted. Farewell.